things about that, and we appreciate his ministry among us this morning. Just a little word about Arnold. I've known him for almost 50 years now. In terms of I was in college. He lived in the apartment complex above me. Got to know him there, and through the crusade, Campus Crusade for Christ, he was often a speaker there while I was in college. He graduated from Dallas Seminary the year I started, so he was gone by the time I started seminary. But then we became friends, and again in San Antonio when his ministry started, he's the director and founder of REL Ministries. Ministry of Jewish Evangelism and Discipleship around the world, and his headquarters started in San Antonio. It's still there, and Arnold got he majored in Greek and Hebrew at Cedarville College. He majored in Hebrew, Dallas Theological Seminary, and then wrote his dissertation for PhD, University of New York, on Israelology. And you can see in the table in the back all the books. He's a very prolific writer. He speaks at conferences around the world, and it's just a real privilege for us to have Arnold come and share with us this morning. And so the call of the prophet Daniel is what we're going to be looking at this morning. And so Arnold, come and share with us, my friends. Do we want to remind you that we would like to take up a love offering for Arnold? So if you do what the Lord feels leads you to do, but just ask that you put it in an envelope and put it in the offering box in the back. So, Arnold,
thank you.
Welcome, my friend.
I'm welcome. Anybody not get a copy of the Daniel outline? Raise your hand. We'll get out to you real quick. Anyone not have one? Okay. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 1. I have two more stories about the rabbi from Helm in Poland. So I'll tell you one at the start of the study, and then the second one at the end of the study. There are many more stories, but a lot of those stories require some knowledge of the Jewish community and knowledge of certain customs. So they won't translate well, but these will translate well. The Jewish communities, if they're practicing Jews in every week and Friday evening, because once the sun goes down and 3 stars are visible, that's when the Sabbath officially begins. And Jewish families often have a very ornate Sabbath cup. This is not a Sabbath cup, I will illustrate it. It's usually ornate, often passed down from generation to generation. The rabbi of Helm had a beautiful Sabbath cup. He got it from his father, got it from his grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on. And now it was the turn of the firstborn son to receive the family Sabbath cup. So sits his son down and says, "Son, you will now inherit our family Sabbath cup. So every Friday night from now on, you can enjoy the Sabbath wine, as you see me do every week. But I have to warn you about this cup. Whenever you drink from the Sabbath cup, make sure you only drink from this side. Never, never drink from this side." And the son says, "Well, I'm honored to receive this cup. I know what it means to the family, but I don't understand. What does it matter whether I drink from this side or this side?" Rabbi says, "Son, I'm a very wise man, so you have to listen to me. Only drink from this side of the cup. If you drink from this side of the cup, the wine will spill all over you." Now, the first two verses, you have the historical background. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, which part of the vessels of the house of God, and he carried them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, what we find in the first two verses is the first of three deportations of Jews into Babylonian captivity. And this first one, which Daniel was taken into captivity with three of his friends, was in the year 605 BC. 605 BC. And at that point, the land of Judah fell under the authority of the Babylonian government. And so King Nebuchadnezzar took the city, and this will mark the first of three specific deportations, also mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1, 2 Kings 24, verse 1, and 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 1. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 1, it marks the beginning of the 70 years of captivity. It was Jeremiah who twice predicted the 70 years of captivity, first in chapter 25, verse 10, 25:10 of his book, and then Jeremiah 29, verses 10 through 14 of his book, chapter 29, 10 through 14. And the reason, well, actually two reasons for the captivity and limiting it to exactly 70 years. Let's for a moment keep your finger here and turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Okay, we'll begin with verse 14, 36:14. Moreover, all the chiefs of the priests and the people trespassed very greatly after all the abominations of the house of Jehovah, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. And Jehovah the God of the fathers sent them by his messengers, rising up early, sending because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of Jehovah arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young men or virgin, old men or hoary-headed, and gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of Jehovah, and the treasures of the king and of his princes all, and they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all the palaces, therefore with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels. That's the background. Go back to Daniel chapter 1. There were two main reasons for the 70 years. First of all, failing to follow the necessity of giving the land a sabbatical rest every 7 years. And over the whole period of Israel's history, when they first conquered the land, they did not keep 70 sabbatical years, and that's the reason God gave them into captivity for those same 70 years, so that the land will finally have rest. And that point is made in the passage we just read, but in verse 21. But the second major reason for the captivity itself was for their idolatry. So in 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 15, 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 15, and in the 2 Chronicles passage we just read, also Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 20 to 23, Jeremiah 44, 20 to 23, they went to captivity into Babylonia, which seems a bit odd, because idolatry first began in the city of Babylon, way back in the early chapters of Genesis, especially Genesis chapter 11. That's where idolatry began. And Babylon became a main center of idolatry in the ancient world. And all kinds of temples to different gods and goddesses. And so why would God bring the people of Judah as captivity right into the very center of idolatry. And the reason is, in the course of those 7 years of captivity, they saw so much of idolatry that finally they gave up on idolatry. And by the time they returned from captivity back to Judea and back to Galilee, idolatry largely ceased to be a Jewish problem. It broke out now and then, but very rare. And verse 2 describes the actual fall. King Jehoiakim was given to the hands of the Babylonians. Now, throughout the book of Daniel, you'll see God referred to as simply Lord. Capital L, small O-R-D. In Hebrew, simply Adonai, Lord. That's the main usage in Daniel, but it's in the plural form. The only time God's four-lettered name of God is going to appear only in one chapter, that's chapter 9. In chapter 9, he appears as Yahweh, as Jehovah. But outside the one chapter, it never mentions him by his actual name, but emphasizes that as God and not Nebuchadnezzar, who is the master of the earth, the master of the universe. And it's not because the superiority of the Babylonian army that in 605 it put the whole land of Israel under Babylonian sovereignty. It's because God himself turned over his own people, his own country, his own city into the hand of the Babylonians. A point also made in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. 2 Kings 24, verses 1 and 2. And furthermore, part of the vessels of the temple was given over to Nebuchadnezzar and were taken into Babylonia during the first deportation. In the second deportation, which will happen in the year 597 BC, there'll be a more thorough spoiling of the temple because of a revolt against Babylon. And this point is made in 2 Kings 24, verse 13, 2 Kings 24, 13. And finally, when there was another rebellion, then came the third deportation, but with that deportation, the city was destroyed, the temple torn down, and Solomonic temple ceased to exist. And that's in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 13 through 17. 2 Kings 25, 13 through 17. But there's this destruction of the city and the temple and the third deportation that fulfilled two key prophecies. One found in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 12 through 18. 2 Kings 20, 12 through 18. And Isaiah chapter 39, verses 1 through 8. Isaiah 39, verses 1 through 8. But the fact that all of these temple vessels were taken to captivity will later prove fatal to the Babylonian kingdom and the Babylonian empire that Daniel will cover later in chapter 5 of his book. Now, part of this was restored under Cyrus, the Persian king, when Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel. But this is in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 7 through 11, Ezra 1, 7 through 11, Ezra chapter 6, verse 5, Ezra 6, verse 5. And he took him into land of Shinar, says verse 2. Shinar is another name for Babylonia. Shinar is the land, and within Shinar is the city of Babylon. But Shinar was also called Babylonia, with the city of Babylon in Babylonia, just as New York City is in the state of New York. And he took these vessels into the treasure house of his god, and the main god was Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, M-A-R-D-U-K. Normally, when one nation conquered another in ancient world, the conquering nation would take the images of the gods and goddesses that the conquered people worship, and they would take these images back into the ruling country, the conquering country, and put them in the temples of the conquering countries to visualize to the people conquered that the gods of the conquering nation were stronger than the gods of the conquered nations. But in the temple of Jehovah, there was no image of Yahweh. no image of Jehovah. That was a element that was prohibited. And even though the temple itself fell into idolatry, as we know from the book of Ezekiel, they did not have an image made of Yahweh. And so Nebuchadnezzar had no choice. He couldn't take any images of Jehovah. They did not exist into the temples of Babylonians. So he took the various holy vessels and put them into the temples of Babylonia. But again, in chapter 5, that's going to prove the coming destruction of the Babylonian Empire. Now, next on your outline, we have the selection of the royal children for training in chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. And the selection is made in verses 3 and 4. And the king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring in certain of the children of Israel, even of the seed royal, and of the nobles, youths in whom was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom, and endued with knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability to stand in the king's palace, that he should teach them the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, in verse 3, we have the choosing, and the order is given to a man named Ashpenaz, who was the master of the eunuchs. Now, this Hebrew word for eunuchs could mean one of two things. It could mean merely a high official, as it is in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 36. Genesis 37 and verse 36. But normally it means someone who has been castrated. And this is done with certain people so they can spend the whole time of fulfilling the requirements of the king. And therefore, without the interference of having a marriage and having family. And the normal pattern, which is what was fulfilled here, is so those selected will also be castrated. There's no record of any wives of Daniel and his three friends or any seed of these men. They would not have any. And there were certain limitations for those to be selected. Number one, members of the seed royal, meaning the royal seed of the house of David. And Daniel would have been one of those of the royal seed, not of the direct line of Davidic lineage, or the lineage, but not in the direct line of becoming a king. But he was still of the royal house. And as a second group are the nobles, and probably the three friends were of the noble category of Jewish society. And so all four would have been castrated. And that's why Ashpenaz, the master of eunuchs, would be in charge of them. And the castration of the seed royal, or members of the royal seed, is also a fulfillment of prophecy in the King's passage I gave you and the Isaiah passage I gave you. And Josephus, who was an ancient Jewish historian, also mentions in his history book that they were castrated. And the noble class will consist of the three friends of Daniel. And Daniel is always distinguished from the other three, so Daniel was of the royal house, and the other three members was of the nobility. Notice the name of Israel, because by the time you come to this period of Jewish history, a distinction between Israel and Judah is no longer distinguishable anymore. As you'll often find, although Israel has already been gone for 150 years at this stage, at this point, these terms are being used interchangeably in the exilic and post-exilic books of the scriptures. And in verse 4, we have the qualifications for those to be selected. They were to be youths. That would mean probably ages between 15 and 20. They were to have two physical qualities: no blemish, no physical defects, well-favored, pleasant in appearance. And they also have to have certain mental qualities. Number one, to be skillful in wisdom. They should have a good learning capacity, ability to make distinctions and proper decisions. Secondly, endued with knowledge. This is a word that means individual bits of information, attaining quite a bit of knowledge, an intelligent knowing, having a quick mind, and then thirdly, understanding science. This is the systematic body of knowledge, power of comprehension, and able to learn well. And the purpose of bringing these attributes before they make a final selection is at the end of verse 4 to stand in the king's palace. And to stand means to be given an official position. In this case, to become the liaison between the government and the Jews. In other words, to become administrators of Jewish affairs. Just like in our government, we have a separate government to deal with Indian affairs, dealing with the various Indian tribes still existing and how they exist and so on. In this case, you have something similar. These will be Jews who will be administrators of Jewish affairs. And furthermore, to teach them the learning of Babylon, which included science, but also included all areas of the occult. Now, Daniel's three friends did not practice occultism, but they had to learn about the practice because of the situation they were in. And furthermore, to learn the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the tongue of the Chaldeans was Aramaic. And that is something Daniel learned very well. So in chapter 1 and the first few verses of chapter 2 are in Hebrew. The most of chapter 2 through chapter 7 are in Aramaic. Then chapters 8 through 12 reverts back to Hebrew. And so use both languages. And the term Chaldean is used in two senses. Sometimes it focuses on the nationality of the Babylonian citizens, but sometimes it's a separate class of the wise men of Babylonia. Now, the reasons for this selection we know from secular history. They were to serve as hostages of the conquered people. And secondly, their presence will serve as a reminder of the king's conquests. And in verse 5, they were to receive during the time of training regular daily rations. And the food was a portion of the king's dainties, to eat the same thing the king ate that day. So what was fixed for the king was fixed for them, and also the use of the royal wine. And the ration will continue for 3 years. That's the duration of time for their training. And the goal is at the end of 3 years, they will stand before King Nebuchadnezzar. And if they pass the various tests that the king would give them, then they will receive a position of service for the king. However, all of their names are Hebrew names, and so in verse 6 and 7, they all receive some new names. So verse 6 reads, Now among those of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and the prince of the eunuchs gave unto them. Unto Daniel he gave the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. What he gave them now is to change the Hebrew names and give them Babylonian names. Now, the name Daniel in Hebrew, Daniel, means God is my judge. God is my judge. Hananiah, which in Hebrew is pronounced Hananiah, means Jehovah is gracious. Jehovah is gracious. Mishael in Hebrew is exactly the same. Mishael, who is like God is. Who is like God is. And Azariah in Hebrew, Azariah, Jehovah helps. Jehovah helps. Now, some observations about these names. 2 of these names are based upon the name Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God or gods. 2 names are based upon God's 4-lettered name, Yahweh. And that shows them to at least, apparently, they were products of a godly family, unlike the majority of the population of Judah of that day. And the name selected for them in verse 7, for Daniel, his name is now Belteshazzar, which means may Bel, B-E-L, protect his life. May Bel protect his life. It could also mean Bel's prince. Bel's prince. For the Hebrew name Hananiah, he's given the name of Shadrach. And Shadrach has the concept of Shadur. It means the command of Aku, A-K-U, a Babylonian god. The command of Aku could also mean inspired by Aku. Aku was the sun god. And then for Mishael, he's renamed Meshach, and Meshach means who is what Aku is, or who is comparable to Shaiku. S-H-A-K-U, S-H-A-K-U, that's the Babylonian name for Venus. And for Azariah, his name is Aved-Nego in Hebrew, in Aramaic, Eved-Nego. Eved-Nego, meaning the servant of Nebo. The servant of Nebo, N-E-B-O. Nebo means the servant of the shining one, or the servant of the shining fire. Now, some observations about these name changes. The name was given by the prince of eunuchs. However, they were given at Nebuchadnezzar's command. Nebuchadnezzar chose the name, and then Ashpenaz was the one to give them those names. And in biblical history, the power to name someone shows authority over that someone. The power to name someone exercises authority over that someone. And that's why Adam named his wife Eve, showing his authority over her. You see that within this book, you'll see the same principle in chapter 4, verse 8, 4:8 in chapter 5, verse 12, 5:12. And why was he changing their names? Because all the original names were connected with the God of Israel. And that would bring a measure of conviction. But to avoid that conviction, he chose give them new names. Otherwise, why would he care? Now, Nebuchadnezzar did learn about the God of Jerusalem because many of the officers and sections of the Jewish army, before Nebuchadnezzar arrived at Jerusalem, they surrendered to him. And when Nebuchadnezzar inquired why they were surrendering so easily, he was given the message, there is a prophet by the name of Jeremiah that was telling us not to fight against the Babylonians, but to surrender, and that's why they were doing it. So before he finally took the city, he already had a knowledge of the true God and a knowledge of the work of Jeremiah. And examples of this is Jeremiah 39, verses 11 through 14, chapter 39, 11 through 14, chapter 40, verses 1 through 6, chapter 40, verses 1 through 6. So to avoid any connection with the God of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar gives them the names connected with the Babylonian gods. And we see this as a common practice. For example, in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 8, Ezra 1:8, the name is Zerubbabel and the name Sheshbazzar. And Zerubbabel is Hebrew, but Sheshbazzar is Aramaic, meaning the god of Babylon. Although we think today of Esther being a Jewish name, actually her Jewish name, Hebrew name, was Hadassah, not Esther. And the name Esther was actually a Persian name, not a Jewish name back then. It's just simply become a Jewish name, but it was not originally that. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. And what's interesting is that among Christians better recognize the Aramaic names and don't remember what the Hebrew names are. Now, Daniel's name stays more consistent, but the names of his three friends among Christians, they're better known in Christian circles by their Aramaic names, whereas in Jewish circles, they're known by their Hebrew names. Now, the next segment, which covers chapter 1, verses 8 through 16, we have the testing of Daniel and his three friends. And in verses 8 through 10, you have the request by Daniel and his friends to the prince of the eunuchs. And in verse 8, Daniel makes a commitment not to defile himself, not to partake of what was prohibited by the Torah, by the law of Moses. So if he eats of the king's dainties, the meat may not be kosher in accordance with the Mosaic law, or it may be kosher meat, but it was not prepared in accordance with the Mosaic law because it would include fat, it would include blood. And these were prohibited items for the Jews to avoid in the Mosaic law. Furthermore, there might be meat sacrificed to idols, and that was also a problem for the Jewish people. As we even read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 20 and 21, 1 Corinthians 10, 20 and 21. As far as wine is concerned, it was not prohibited under the Mosaic law, but it was used for part of the sacrifices to idols. And in chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 of Daniel, 5, 1 through 3, wine was used for the worship of the Babylonian gods. And therefore he chose not to partake of Babylonian wine because of the way it was used in connection with Babylonian idolatry. And so he made a request of the prince of eunuchs not to defile himself. In verses 9 and 10 is the answer of Ashpenaz. In verse 9, Daniel standing before Ashpenaz during this 3-year period, Daniel was found kindness, he found compassion in the face of Ashpenaz. Nevertheless, Ashpenaz refused. Reason? For fear of the king, because if after the period of testing, Daniel and his 3 friends look worse for wear, it would mean the execution of Ashpenaz. So what Daniel tries next is not to request it from Ashpenaz, but from the steward who worked under Ashpenaz in verses 11 through 16. And in verses 11 through 13, Daniel makes another request. He approaches the steward in verse 11, and again the steward was appointed to work under the prince of the eunuchs, under Ashpenaz, one directly responsible for serving the food. So he does not directly answer to the king, and therefore he would be more willing. And the request is in verses 12 and 13, give us a 10-day test. In these 10 days, feed us only pulse to eat. And the word pulse refers to food growing out of the ground, that which grows out of sown seed, which will include vegetables and grain. And under the Mosaic law, there were no unclean vegetables. So give us pulse to eat in place of the king's dainties, and secondly, give us water to drink in place of Babylonian wine. And then compare us with the other people here and act accordingly. And in verse 14, the steward agrees for that 10-day test. And the results are in verses 15 and 16. Verse 15, they were better than all the others. They were fairer in appearance. They were fatter in flesh. Is it because they were vegetarians and they got fatter that way? Most consistent vegetarians don't get fat. They get thinner. So the lesson here is not that vegetables are better than meat. The lesson here is obedience is better than disobedience. Obedience is better than disobedience. And so they would eat only what was permitted by the Torah, by the Mosaic law. And then there'll be and if they prove to be better, there'll be a continuation of the vegetarian diet in verse 16, and so it is. So in verses 17 to 21, we have the blessing of Daniel and his 3 friends. And verse 17 describes the development of all 4 of these young Jewish men. All received knowledge and skill in both learning and wisdom. But for Daniel, and this is where you see his call to the prophetic office, for Daniel, he was given understanding in all visions and dreams. And that will set the stage for the rest of the book. Understanding all visions and dreams. And so in verses 18 to 20, they receive appointment to the king's service. And in verse 18, they're all presented before Nebuchadnezzar, and the prince of eunuchs who's responsible for them brought them before Nebuchadnezzar to be tested and have passed for the appointment. And so in verse 19 it says the king communed with them, meaning he tested them, and found them to be superior to all the other prisoners of war. Therefore, because they passed the test, they stood before the king, meaning they were appointed to specific offices. And furthermore, Nebuchadnezzar also notices a tenfold superiority in verse 20. And the area of superiority is in all areas that were tested by the king, in areas of wisdom and understanding. And furthermore, they superseded the Egyptian magicians. The magicians were those who literally, the word means to use the stylus, but those that were knowledgeable in Babylonian sacred writings. And the enchanters, these were the well-known in those days, the Ashlav, A-S-H-L-A-V, A-S-H-L-A-V, the Ashlav priests. And then the chapter concludes in verse 21, and Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. The first year of King Cyrus is the year 539 through 538 BC. That's not when his career ended, because we later read in chapter 10, verse 1, that the ministry of Daniel did not end with the first year, continued until the third year of Cyrus. But the point he makes here is simply this, that Daniel was there for the whole duration of the 70 years of captivity. The whole duration. So his actual ministry lasted at least another 2 or 3 years. Now, some basic lessons and some other elements that are uniqueness of his prophecies, but the basic lesson of chapter 1 is there will always be a believing remnant among the Jewish people that believe. In this case, it was Daniel and his 3 friends, Daniel of the royal house and the 3 friends of the nobility. While the majority of both the king's house and the priesthood and so on, were practicing idolatry. But in the case of this issue, these 4 were loyal members of the remnant of that day. But secondly, the remnant suffers the fate of the nation. Why did the nation go to captivity? Primarily because of idolatry, but these 4 men never practiced idolatry. But members of the remnant do have to suffer the disciplines of the nation as a whole. Now, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, for example. About 250,000 were Messianic Jews from the times of Eastern Europe. The remnant suffers the fate of the nation. Let's talk about elements, uniqueness of his prophecies. Number 1, he's the one that will outline the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles will be a time where Gentiles have authority over the land and over the city. It will be a time of 4 Gentile empires. The first one is what he fell under, the Babylonian Empire. Secondly, what he also fell under, the Medo-Persian Empire. Then beyond his time, the third is the Hellenistic or Greek Empire. But he'll point out in his prophecies that the 4th empire is never named. But it follows a policy, and he keeps emphasizing that there was something about the 4th empire that made it distinctive from the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and the Hellenistic empires, and that distinctiveness was the policy of imperialism. And imperialism means that when you conquer a nation, you use the own members of the conquering nation to exercise authority over the conquered nation. That was not true of the first 3 empires. When Babylon conquered Judea, what did Babylon do? They appointed Jews to rule over the conquered Jewish people under Babylonian sovereignty. Medo-Persia did the same things. You have Jewish governors such as Zerubbabel, such as Nehemiah, such as Ezra, ruling under Medo-Persian authority. And when the Hellenists ruled the empire, and that included the land of Israel, the high priest would have the authority over the people, the Jewish people in the promised land. But Rome was different. Wherever Rome conquered, Romans were sent in to rule. And that made it distinctive. And furthermore, Daniel will point out that the Fourth Empire will undergo five specific stages. Five specific stages. I won't go into the details here. And we often refer to the Fourth Empire as the Roman Empire. That's only true at the first stage. And during the first stage, United States, is the Roman Empire, but then it came into a second stage, a two-division stage. We're still living in that stage. Thirdly, will come a world government stage. And fourthly, will come a 10-division stage. And finally, the Antichrist stage. So that's the uniqueness about his prophecies. He tells us a lot about the final ruler of the four Gentile empire, and thus the Antichrist. A lot of detail that no other prophet gave us. And the Antichrist will rule the entire world with some exceptions for the second half of the tribulation, therefore the second 3.5 years. And Daniel also reveals that he doesn't give us the exact reason. That's told us later in other writings. But Daniel will tell us that the goal of the Antichrist is to totally annihilate the Jewish people. And the reason for that is to avoid the second coming. Another factor unique to Daniel's prophecies is the revelation of a 75-day period between the end of the tribulation, and it ends with the second coming of the Messiah, and the establishment of the kingdom. There'll be a 75-day period in chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. Chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. In that 75-day period, a number of things will occur. For example, the resurrection of the Old Testament saints. They're not resurrected at the time of the rapture. They're resurrected at the time following the second coming, resurrected in the 75-day period. Also resurrected will be the martyr tribulation saints in the 75-day period. In the 75-day period, there'll also be the final regathering and restoration of the Jewish people from all over the world. In the 75-day period, the city of Jerusalem will be rebuilt as a brand new city, and the temple will be also rebuilt, but not in Jerusalem, but a number of miles north of Jerusalem. Another uniqueness about Daniel's prophecies is where we have in chapter 9, the only chapter where God's name is mentioned. It's mentioned 7 specific times, but the only chapter where it's mentioned. And here we have his famous prophecy of the 77s. Literally, not 70 weeks in Hebrew, but 77s. He is now back to Hebrew. So a period of 490 years is decreed upon David's people, that means the Jewish people, Daniel's people, the Jewish people, Daniel's city, Jerusalem, to fulfill the 6 elements, which we won't detail now, but the 6 elements of verse 24. And he divides the 77s into 3 divisions. 7 sevens, so 49 years. That's the period of time when Jerusalem will be rebuilt after they return from Babylonia. And that's followed by 62 sevens for a total of 483 years. Now, there's no break between the first subdivision and the second subdivision, because one second division immediately follows by the follows the first division. But the third division doesn't immediately follow. So notice that things that happen at the end of the 69th seven and the 70th seven. Verse 26, number 1, after the 62 7 shall the anointed one, the Messiah, be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the cutting off took place when Messiah died in the year AD 30. Second, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Notice it doesn't say that the prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary, but the people out of whom he will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And the phrase, the prince that shall come, has a definite article, because he spoke of him twice before, in chapter 7 and again in chapter 8. And that's what we now call the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will come out of the same ethnic identity as the people who destroyed the city and the temple. And AD 70, that was done by the Romans. And so something else that Daniel notices that gives us new information, that not only will the Antichrist be the last ruler of the four Gentile empire, he himself ethnically will be a descendant of the Roman identity, the Roman ethnic identity. He'll be a Gentile of Roman origin. And the third event, and to the end, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, even unto the end shall be war. Desolations are determined. They have a long period of warfare and desolations in the area of the land of Israel and the Middle East. So now we also notice a gap of time between the 69th 7 and the 70th 7, the last 7 years, which are the same 7 years of the tribulation, just to give us a sign by which we can know when the last 7 years begin. And we read this in verse 27, and he. And again, in Hebrew grammar, the he goes back to his nearest antecedent, the prince that shall come, and he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 7. And what begins the last 7 years, the 7 years tribulation, what begins that period of time is the signing of the 7-year covenant. Too often people assume when the rapture occurs that the tribulation starts the very next day. Not necessarily. It could happen that way, but does not necessarily happen that way. It could happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We don't know when the rapture will occur. But the event that actually signals the tribulation will not be the rapture of the church, but the signing of the covenant. And that will trigger those last 7 years. And finally, he deals with the timing of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will happen only following that 75-day interval. Only then will come to pass. So these are some of the unique prophecies of the prophet Daniel. And he gives a lot of details about the tribulation in chapter 8 and in chapter 11 and 12 and so on. So he gives us some very long-term prophecies. We have some time for questions, so let me give you the second story for the rabbi of hell. And then we'll take some questions. In Europe, usually there's a school that was built right next to the synagogue, and that was true with the synagogue of hell. And it was getting rather crowded, and so they felt they needed to expand the school problem, and so the rabbi hired several workers from hell to expand the school to take in more students. As the workers were working, he decided to check to see how they were doing, and noticed one worker doing a strange thing. He would pull out a nail and look at it and hammer in. He pulls out a second nail and looks at it, but throws it away. So some nails he hammered in, but some nails he threw away. And Rabbi asked him, "Why are you throwing these good nails away?" And the helm worker said, "Well, when I pulled the nail out of the back and look at it, I noticed they sometimes put the head at the wrong end of the nail. I cannot hammer in that way." Rabbi says, no, you don't understand. These are for the other side of the building. Okay, if you have a question, just raise your hand and then wait for the mic to get to you. Who's got the first question this morning? All right, we'll skip the first question again. Who's got the second question this morning? Any questions about anything? Okay, one more time. Any third questions? All right, you get a longer break.
It is Arnold's custom to have a time of question and answer time afterwards. We've got one more session with Dr. Fruchtenbaum. We're going to take about a 20-minute break, and so get some refreshments out there.